find what you're strong at, what you're uniquely strong at, what you're uniquely passionate about, and then keep acting on it.
Welcome to the Negative Space podcast presented by the Anthem Awards. I'm Patricia McLoughlin, General Manager of the Anthem Awards and also your host. In this season, we're taking a look at the ways in which social impact work is actually getting made. Since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, the landscape for reproductive rights and advocacy has shifted almost beyond recognition. 31 states have moved to restrict or ban abortion access. Providers are leaving the states, patients are having to cross lines for care, and in some instances, people are going without care entirely. And the organizations fighting to protect these rights have had to figure out how to communicate with urgency without burning out their audiences and keeping them engaged. The Center for Reproductive Rights is one of the leading global advocacy organizations dedicated to guaranteeing reproductive rights as a fundamental human right. My guest today is Julia Taylor Kennedy, Senior Director of Corporate Engagement at the Center for Reproductive Rights, where she's helping lead this fight. And we're going to be talking all about what it's taking to make content that moves people, the conversations that are being had, and how we can all find a little hope together. Julia, welcome to the Negative Space.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the Negative Space. I love the concept of the podcast, and I just love being here with you. So really appreciate it.
To get us started here, I would love to hear a little bit about your career path, what actually led you to the Center for Reproductive Rights, and also a little bit about the work that you guys are doing right now.
As you mentioned, I lead the Center for Reproductive Rights corporate engagement program, which we've been building since 2023. In the wake of the Dobbs decision, employers were wondering what this meant for their employees around the country and how they could support them in getting high quality reproductive health care. And so we work closely with companies and businesses of all sizes to think about how to support employees, how to support their users if they're tech companies, how to support their patients if they're healthcare companies, both internally as well as externally, thinking about advocating for the policies that are really going to benefit the economy and their companies in particular. I come to this work knowing how hard it can be for businesses to find their sea legs in speaking out on issues like these and figuring out how to address them. Working with companies, mostly Fortune 500, on culture and engagement questions in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also in talent management of all types. And I originally entered this work when I was a public radio host. So being on a podcast is very fun for me. My last job in public radio was to host a show on gender called 51%, where I talked to a lot of guests about these questions of work and career advancement for women, and kind of got bitten by the bug of those issues ever since then, many years ago.
Love that. And from where you're sitting right now, what is happening within the reproductive rights landscape, both in the US, but I also know there's a lot happening globally right now?
That is an enormous question, Patricia. There is so much happening around the world and in the US, and our job at the Center for Reproductive Rights is to help make sense of it all for different stakeholders. You know, we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization, not political, but legal in nature. And so my colleagues are these really smart lawyers who can both analyze and understand public policy implications and advise on better public policy to improve our access to reproductive rights and health, and also litigate in the courts when needed to reestablish or to establish for the first time in some countries access to reproductive rights and the right to bodily autonomy. So to answer your question a little more directly, it is chaotic right now. You know, in the US, I mentioned we have lost our federally protected right to abortion. And so depending on the state where you're sitting in, your state constitution may have established a right to abortion or to bodily autonomy, or your state may have a ban on abortion. So it really varies country by country. We have world and US maps on our website, reprorights.org, where you can look up the policies of the spot that you're interested in. But the issue that we are most tightly focused on right now here in the US is access to medication abortion, because this has served as a lifeline to patients across the country, whether they're in a state where abortion is protected or a state where abortion is banned, through telehealth, they can still access abortion care from certain providers who are sitting within protected states. And this is under attack from opponents to abortion rights. And so that's a big focus of our work right now. And I think for those who are concerned about reproductive health care access and reproductive rights, that should be a big focus for them as well. And then a second big area of focus is to think about the maternity care deserts that are growing up across the country, in all parts of the country, but especially within banned states. Because understandably, OBGYNs and doctors who serve pregnant patients are often leaving states where they can't provide the full spectrum of care. And that means there are more and more counties without any OBGYNs living there and practicing there. And that has huge implications for patients who then have to travel across state borders or at least across county lines in order to get care. In our world, the private sector, that means more time off of work, more negative outcomes, less quality care. And so that impacts folks' ability to show up fully in the workplace and in their careers.
And in your role, how have you seen companies respond to this moment a little bit, and how are they supporting their female workers?
Great question. There's a whole range of responses. We saw hundreds of companies speaking out publicly and still holding those policies privately now to provide more benefits for employees to be able to travel for any reason to get medical care. And then, implicitly, it's often in order to get abortion care if they need it. And so many companies have benefits on the books that provide stipends or time off in order to access care across the country in the US. And then we've also seen companies responding in other ways. The biotech and pharmaceutical industry has been speaking out in a few ways. We're working with them to help educate them on how their industry is impacted and can be impacted by restriction on medication abortion, for example. And we were so gratified to see hundreds of pharmaceutical and biotech companies file an amicus brief in a case about medication abortion a few years ago. And we saw pharma, the biggest association of pharmaceutical companies, file another amicus brief in a very recent case a few weeks ago that was in front of the Supreme Court to argue that access to medication abortion through telehealth is really important, not just for the purposes of abortion care, but also to protect FDA authority to approve medicines that are safe and effective. Because imagine if a vaccine became suddenly politicized or a cancer drug, that would leave patients across the country high and dry and confused and have terrible implications for the risk that investors might take when they're making a bet on a new drug that could save lives. So that's one industry that's been speaking out. And then we also work with companies to meet with lawmakers, often quietly behind the scenes, to talk about how concerned they are to protect their employees' health and wellness in different pockets of the country where it's harder for them to access care of any sort, OBGYN care, let alone abortion care.
It's nice to see how people are stepping up in different ways, but how are you seeing these impacts hitting people's everyday lives in ways that just aren't fully understood or talked about yet?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is an area of work that I think is so critically important when we're talking about something that has an economic impact. People don't immediately think going to an OBGYN might impact our economy, but it really does. And so we've been partnering with researchers to better understand what those impacts look like, and then also putting out a report that illustrates the impacts story by story. The report's called The Price of Safety. In it, we profile different individuals who have moved because they've had a bad healthcare experience and want to have another kid, and so they move to a different state in order to have a safer pregnancy. We interview CEOs who have changed their benefits policies because of their own personal experience with miscarriage or abortion care, or because they are concerned about the state policies that are going to impact their workers. And we interview physicians who are thinking about changing where they practice in order to provide the full spectrum of care. So we have those stories in the Price of Safety report, and I encourage everyone to check it out. But we also work with economists out of Georgia Tech and at organizations like the Institute for Women's Policy Research to understand at scale what these costs are looking like. And these will accumulate more over time. But a team of researchers out of Georgia Tech found that since the Dobbs decision, which is now 4 years ago, I can't believe it's the 4-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, each quarter, 52,000 people have moved out of ban states due to the bans. And so that adds up to hundreds of thousands of people who are literally uprooting their lives as they're thinking about building their families. These are primarily college-educated young workers who are changing their address so that they can get care safely and build their lives in a place where they can have access to the full spectrum of reproductive care. We also worked with researchers who found that among those who are thinking about having kids within the next decade, 1 in 5 have either moved or know someone who has moved due to the bans. And if you think about what that means, changing states, often that means leaving your family, it means finding a new job, it means developing all kinds of new social networks. This is a big decision that folks are undertaking because that having quality care and being able to safely build your family is so important.
No, it really is. And even as someone that's within that age group, you see people making these decisions. And I'm lucky to be living in New York City, but even here, it's an ongoing discussion as we see so many of these challenges happening. But the Price of Safety report is incredible and really moving, and we'll make sure we have it linked in the show notes for everyone to be able to access as well. But I think it just does such a good job of creating a real human feel and makes things much more tangible and understandable for folks that maybe aren't in these situations. But I'm curious, as you guys were deciding to do this, who were you hoping that this would reach and the impact that you were aiming to have through telling a lot of these stories?
As you say, we're looking to reach folks who may generally be aware that some states have abortion bans or that things may be changing, but don't understand the different decisions that CEOs may be making or individual folks may be making to uproot their lives. You know, a lot of the people we reach are really passionate about reproductive health care, but they don't know exactly how to engage or what they can do. And I think the report also gives some great numbers and stories that folks can tell others within their own networks to share, oh, here's an idea of something we could consider at our company in terms of a policy or in terms of thinking about where we want to open our next location or host our next conference where we're asking folks who might be pregnant to travel. So it has these stories that also give tangible examples of how people can behave differently in the day-to-day within their companies.
Yeah, it's kind of like that NIMBY mentality of, well, it's not affecting me personally at this point in time. But as you kind of zoom out and as you look at this bigger issue, it really is touching all corners of the country, whether you're in a red state or a blue state or a purple state. It is apparent everywhere and going to continue to impact all of our lives and for women across the country. But I'm curious too, often I think we see an economic analysis or these beautiful personal stories, and you guys brought that together in a really impactful way. So I'm curious how that decision was made and when you make that decision to mesh these two kind of stories and narratives together to really have that impact.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And it was very intentional. You know, I think that it's easy to discount an individual story to say that's just one person. Or you can glaze over when you hear a number and not necessarily understand the individual impact. And so as a longtime researcher who's been working within research think tanks on social issues for a really long time, I think that it's really important to bring that qualitative storytelling piece and the quantitative numbers together to paint a robust picture. In essence, the numbers tell you the scale of a problem and the stories tell you the human toll. One of the stories that I will never forget that we collected as part of this was of Kayla Smith, who underwent a traumatic experience with her first pregnancy in Texas, had a complication where her baby would not survive and she was unable to get the emergency abortion care that she needed. And it was a really harrowing situation that was quite traumatic. And she has survived, but she decided, I want another child. I'm not going to do this in my state. And she moved to Washington in order to have her child. And so that story of Kayla really brings to life the dire situation that folks are in and the lengths that they will go to. She and her husband gave up tens of thousands of dollars in income to make that moved far away from their family and support networks. But for the peace of mind that it gave them when they became pregnant again, it was well worth it.
Yeah. And you've mentioned that we are coming up on the anniversary of 4 years since the Dobbs decision. And I'm curious, over this period of time for the center, how have you guys had to shift how you tell some of these stories, or has there been a shift in the ways in which you communicate some of this information?
There has been a huge shift, actually. I think there are things that have changed within reproductive rights. There are things that have changed in terms of how people are consuming information today versus how they were consuming it a few years ago, and we've had to change our approach as well. One is we've been working with individual plaintiffs in a way that we didn't used to. We decided rather than only representing doctors and providers, we needed to represent the individuals who are impacted by the system in state court, not just federal court, to show how unclear the exceptions are to abortion bans in different states. And even though we know that we won't win all of these cases, to us, they are so important to make sure that folks who are losing their fertility on death's door have their day in court to say, these laws on the books are causing people to die and to live through traumatic experiences that will affect their ability to build families for the rest of their lives. So in Texas, we filed a case with 22 plaintiffs that has gotten a lot of national attention, called Zorowski v. Texas, and we lost that case. However, there's a documentary that premiered at Telluride Film Festival featuring the lead plaintiff, Amanda Zorowski, along with 2 other plaintiffs in the case, and has been an enormous vehicle to call more attention to what's going on in Texas. We've had amazing news coverage of the things that are happening that I think people just are not aware of. We've filed similar lawsuits in Tennessee where some of the plaintiffs have become political candidates and leaders out of this experience, and fierce advocates, not just on our issue, but across the board to make sure that our society is moving in a better direction. So I think that this shift in strategy for the center has been monumental for the movement, but also for these individuals who are able to be empowered from an experience that was incredibly disempowering in the beginning. The only other thing that I'll say is that we're finding, and this is not different from what a lot of folks are finding, given your own focus at the Anthem Awards and your own focus on storytelling, folks' attention spans are so much shorter, and trust in different messengers is in much shorter supply. And so it's so critical for us to be working with people who can tell authentic stories to others who trust them, because that's who we're trusting right now. It's folks that we see on social media who we can relate to, who give us information, and then that's who we believe, rather than necessarily the authorities that maybe were trusted in the past. And so we think that bringing up those individual stories that are, yes, backed by the numbers and research and what we know to be true is critical to making people aware of what's happening across the country.
Yeah, and going off of that too, I'm so curious across advocates, donors, plaintiffs, women across the country, what conversations are you having most often right now? And what are some of the big questions that are rising up from folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting time to be in corporate engagement because a lot of our work at the center is with providers, patients, other repro movement orgs. And so when I'm working on our corporate engagement work, I'm encountering people with tons of different views all across the country and sometimes funnel those questions and that information back to my colleagues at Center for Reproductive Rights because it's such a broad spectrum that we're engaging with. We recently did an activation with the handbag company Clairvy in Nashville. And it was really interesting to talk to the folks in the audience there and understand the questions that are coming up for them. You know, Tennessee is a banned state and doesn't get necessarily as much attention here in New York and in California as a big state like Texas does.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to talk to the folks there who feel that they're not sure how quickly the laws are changing or what the laws are on the books. They're not sure what information they're getting from their doctors and if they're getting if their doctors are able to give them frank and full advice. They're asking questions about, you know, how there can be a federal protection put back in place and how long that might take, which is several years. And they're also asking, you know, what can I, as a business owner or as an employee, do or expect in order to access good care? And what are some of the workarounds for these policies that are on the books that employers can put in place? So we're getting these really fascinating questions that to me speak to the need for continued public education and continued guidance as things shift so quickly.
And for a lot of these people, I think there's a large feeling of hopelessness, I think, across cause areas right now, whether it's looking at the climate space or looking at things like abortion rights. And as we see so many of these stories coming up and reaching people in new and different ways, I think a lot of us want to stand up, want to be a better supporter, want to be a better advocate. But how can people actually step up to the plate in this moment?
Yeah, I hear you. I struggle with this too. I doom scroll along with everybody else, and it can be extremely disheartening. And there can be a strong instinct to disengage, in fact, because it seems so vast and insurmountable, some of the challenges that we're facing. For me as an individual who is where my livelihood is working on fighting one of these fights, I find that my sense of overwhelm and anxiety is really soothed through engagement. And so I offer that up to remind everyone, it may not be your day-to-day professional job to fight for reproductive freedom, but it may also help to engage at all. And there are small ways and bigger ways to engage. And so the first thing that I say to folks is find something that you're good at and that you're passionate about that is authentic to you. So you've made it this far in this podcast, you're passionate about reproductive rights and health. So you've got your passion. Think about what your skill set is. Maybe you are a great storyteller, and so you can be sharing your own story or the story of folks that you know. Maybe you aren't a great storyteller, but you're great at making a plan and operationalizing things, and you can volunteer at a local clinic to think about how they can be reaching out to stakeholders in the area, or engage. You can donate your resources. Maybe you have some savings set aside for philanthropy, and you can think about the right abortion fund to give to, or the Center for Reproductive Rights, whatever works for you. From a business perspective, if you're a member of an ERG or you have a colleague who's in HR, you can call them up and ask about the benefits that are on the books, send them to organizations like Reproductive Maternal Health Compass to understand what some of the best practices are when it comes to reproductive and maternal health. Or if you're at a company that has a progressive brand like Clairvy or Levi's or Bumble or Yelp or Lululemon or the many companies that we're partnering with, you can encourage them to speak out on this issue as well. And we're happy to connect to support that. But, some CEOs are still writing op-eds about the importance of access to reproductive care, and a lot are thinking, what can I do that's behind the scenes? And so there's a whole spectrum of ways to engage, and we've got endless ideas for folks. My steer would be, even if it seems insurmountable, think of a person you can talk to, a post you can make, a small way to get started.
And I think so much of a way we think about this and at the Anthem Awards is the power of amplification. That's why we do what we do. And so even just regularly sharing the posts that you're seeing on social media, sharing the report that we've talked about today with folks and getting them thinking about this in a different way is powerful. And it does actually change the way other people are considering some of these things. But we've talked a little bit around this feeling of hopelessness, and people are burnt out and everything feels doom and gloom sometimes. But I'm curious for you guys. Obviously, again, it's been 4 years since the Dobbs decision, and I think that took the wind out of a lot of people's sails. So within that, and considering the burnout of what's happening in the space and the continued push, how has that also kind of shaped the way you guys are communicating and telling stories and producing content?
Things have changed so much, and there are a few ways that we keep focus. One is, yes, this was a big loss, and it woke people up. So I am having such more nuanced conversations with friends and family about abortion than I was before the Dobbs decision. I think people are getting educated, and the polling data shows people want access to this. People believe in having the right to abortion care, and that individuals should be able to decide what they're doing with their bodies. So that gives me hope, which is public opinion is on our side. This is something people want to restore. The other thing that I think is really critical and shapes how we're talking to people about the issue is to remind them that progress can be made in local communities and at the state level. We're seeing language in state constitutions that is so much more progressive than what was protected by precedent in the Roe v. Wade decision. And that can inspire our Congress when things are in a better spot for those who support access to abortion to be inspired by that state policy at a federal level, which we think is critical to restoring nationwide access. And the last thing that gives me a lot of hope, which is useful at a global organization, is to look to Latin America. And if you Google the green wave in Latin America, you'll see countries like Colombia, like Mexico, other countries that we thought were a long way off in terms of putting in place a right to abortion, that in recent years, thanks to the hard work and leadership of a lot of my colleagues in Latin America, have put in place really progressive policies around abortion access and rights. And so the fact that it can be done around the world and is still happening in a lot of places in really exciting ways gives us a lot of hope at the center.
It's so wonderful to see, again, some of those advances that are happening and just to remind ourselves of the good that comes from this work over time. And unfortunately, in the United States, though, it feels like we're in this increasingly divisive political environment. And especially as we approach the midterms, I feel like things are only getting a little bit hotter. But for the center, what do you want to call out about what it takes to do this work and to continue to show up for you and your team and everyone working within this space in this moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think every individual is different. Mm-hmm. For me, as I said before, I derive a lot of satisfaction in fighting for something that I think is actually not political. I think it's healthcare and it's human rights. And so to be asserting that and working with partners who get it in every context, including women's ability to make the decisions they need to build thriving careers and to be talking to the executives who understand it and are in the trenches and want to make sure that others understand this. That's inspiring to me and gives me a lot of energy. There are, of course, moments where things happen or come out of the administration that work against what I think is a basic human right or in the interest of citizens' healthcare. And that can be dispiriting. But in some ways, for those of us who are advocates, that just gives us a kick in the pants to fight even harder. I have a colleague who said when she entered the reproductive rights movement, she had a mentor who said, you have to understand that this is a fight where holding the line and keeping things from regressing is just as important as progress. And understanding the importance of holding the line can also help me remember this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And every contribution of every person who is working towards progress matters.
As we're going ahead here, obviously the podcast is called The Negative Space, and we've already discussed a lot of the unseen challenges happening behind the work that folks that are just coming across this on a day-to-day basis might not be thinking about. But I'm curious if there's one specific challenge that you're facing or your team is facing in this that you want to call out.
Yeah, there is. I'm glad you raised it. And it has come up, got towards it a little bit earlier in the conversation, which is we were talking about, okay, people are concerned about banned states. They may be sitting in New York or in LA or SF and thinking, okay, I'm not impacted. But the reality is that funding for women's health care clinics has been cut across the country. Maternity care deserts are growing across the country. One of the lawsuits around medication abortion would make it harder to get a medication abortion via telehealth across the country. A lot of the impacts that we're seeing in this fight are not limited to banned states. And especially when you think about maternity care deserts, there's a fantastic, I'm a research geek. There's a fantastic tracker on the March of Dimes website that lays out counties that don't have OBGYNs residing within them. And they are across the country. So people who are living in rural areas in any state across the country have real challenges getting reproductive care right now. And that's very important for all employers and companies to be aware of, which is their employees may be having to work extra hard to get care. And they need to have those benefits on the books, but also it behooves them to be fighting for better policy around reproductive care access because it's affecting everyone across the country.
You even see it in data around people applying to residency programs around the country and things like that, whether or not they feel like they can properly do their jobs in some places or not, or whether they're being held back. So it's really such a challenging environment to be doing this. But I do want to look ahead and think about the opportunities for progress and hope and where we can still be doing more, whether across partnerships, ways in which we can continue to battle misinformation, which has been a big part of this. But what areas can we continue to really make an impact that might be a little underutilized at this point?
Great question. I think we spoke earlier about folks tapping into what they're good at. One thing that I would add to that list is if you're great at tech and data, there is a lot to be done because as we increasingly are asking our AI friends for answers on healthcare questions, there's a lot of misinformation that can come in there. And so we're undertaking initiatives and partnerships with companies that are working on AI safety. But for anyone in that space, it's wide open and needing of support. So you can always reach out to us. You can find us at reprorights.org or reach out to me at jkennedy@reprorights.org to understand more about what can be done at your company. No matter the size, we have different ideas and resources. But you can also be lifting up, to your point, Patricia, be lifting up research that you see, interesting stories you come across, articles that open your eyes to something, share that with folks in your network so that they're also tracking this issue. Another great resource is Abortion Every Day from Jessica Valenti. She's doing fantastic reporting on this. So I could go on and on and on, frankly, but there are a few ways to get started.
There's so much happening, so many ways to get involved. And another thing that I think about too is we've been in these situations before and we've risen back up. And I've been talking with some folks at Miss Magazine, and they've even done a digital archive of 50 plus years of their stories and content.
Mm.
It's looking back and having that understanding of where we've been and where we've come and the highs and lows of this work that have happened over time. It just gives me a little bit of hope we can get back up. And we will, most importantly.
Women are powerful. We do so much in our lives. We take on so much. We can take this on. And I think the answer is through collective action. So I'm so glad to hear about that. I'm going to check it out from Ms. But yes, I know this is hard and I know we can do it.
Yeah. And to kind of wrap things up here at the Anthem Awards, we celebrate all of our partners and winners with one sentence call to action speeches. So I'm curious what one reminder, challenge, or vision you'd like to leave our listeners with today.
Find your way in and act. That is what I would say. Find what you're strong at, what you're uniquely strong at, what you're uniquely passionate about, and then keep acting on it.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. And before we go, I just want to highlight again and let people know where can they find more information about the center, where can they find the report, and where can they get involved?
ReproRights.org. Price of Safety is the name of the report, and it's on our website. And through that website, you will find all kinds of resources and ways to donate to the center, follow us on social, and find other partners of ours in the movement who are doing really important work.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And for all of those listening, I hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, rate us, and all of those things wherever you're watching or listening. For more information about the Anthem Awards, you can visit us online at anthemawards.com and at Anthem Awards on social media. I'd also like to invite you to set the new standard for good in the Anthem Awards this year by entering your work before Friday, July 31st. Thank you again for listening. I'm Patricia McLoughlin, and this was The Negative Space.